Hi all. It's just a quick test to check for the voice. Am I audible to everyone? You can just put it in the chat and then we'll start in a minute.
Check.
Okay, great. So I welcome you all to this webinar on how to use assessment center in competency mapping. Before getting into the webinar, I would like to set some ground rules for the webinar. Because this is a 1 hour webinar, I request everyone to be on mute and put your queries and suggestions and questions, everything in the chat box. The facilitators would try to answer all the queries. And also before moving on, I'd like to introduce Strendscape to people here. So Strendscape is an organizational development and transformation company headquartered in Bangalore. And we are a team of trained and certified facilitators, coaches, psychologists, e-learning developers, and sales professionals. And we help to develop and create mechanisms for development, motivation, and creativity that enables employees to give their best every day in the organization. So that's a bit about us. Moving on to the services that we offer. Uh, we offer different services like behavioral training, certifications, certifications like this certification, instructional design certification. We are also launching our competency mapping certification shortly in June. And we also have going to launch a DNI certification. And we have competency mapping as a separate service as well. And we also offer digital learning service, executive coaching, image consulting service, OD consulting, psychometric assessments. In psychometric assessments, we are partnered with John Wiley to offer everything disc assessments, which is a behavioral assessment. And we are also partnered with Central Test, which is a French-based company, to provide competency-based assessments as well. And apart from that, we are also launching technical training services. Moving on, the facilitators for the day are Sanjeev Jain and Sushil Tayal. I'll request both of them to introduce themselves and then on they'll take this webinar forward. Thank you.
Sneha, am I audible? Hello, am I audible?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. So this is Sanjeev Jain. So I am, have about 3 decades of HR experience, and I am a certified coach and facilitator. And I have worked in different organizations like IBM. I mean, last 11 years was with IBM. And in IBM, I had the opportunity to use assessment centers for various developmental and selection exercises. So I'll be happy to share my perspective on this topic. And along with me, I have Sushil Tayal. So I'll request him to also introduce himself.
Yeah. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sushil Tayal, like Sanjeev. I'm experienced HR professional for about 3 decades. And the organizations I have worked spread across varied industries, which is newspaper, logistic distribution, banking, BPO space. And my last assignment has been in the corporate for an Europe's second largest IT organization, where I was leading the HR function around. And for last about 9 years, I have been working exclusively on this competency and competency assessment and development for different organizations. Happy to be with you guys to spend an hour on assessments.
Thank you, Sushil. Okay, so let's move forward. Yeah, so let's go through the agenda for today. So what we want to do today is define what is an assessment center. And I assume, a lot of us are HR professionals, and we might have either experienced it ourselves or would have read about it or would have heard from some fellow professionals. So we'll talk a little more about what an assessment center is all about. We will also talk about difference between the assessment center and development center. So there's a subtle difference, and some of us may hear these terms are used interchangeably, but we'd like to clarify what the differences are between the assessment center and a development center very briefly. We'll not spend too much of time on that. We'll also talk about, if we have to use this methodology for assessment, then what are the advantages over other methods which are available to us as HR professionals. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then we'll also talk about or analyze the application of assessment centers in competency mapping in particular, because there are multiple uses of assessment center. But today we'll talk a little more in detail towards the last part of our presentation about how can we use assessment center, particularly in a competency mapping exercise in an organization. Okay, so I think that's the agenda. Then we'll also summarize at the end the development and implementation of assessment center in an organization. For example, if you have to create an assessment center for your organization, respective organization, how can we do that, right? So it's a short time, guys. It's about 1 hour, so we can't go too much of it in detail, but we'll give you a framework which will help you to understand that if you have to develop an assessment center from beginning of the requirement to actually developing a center and running it, what are the steps involved. So we'll talk a little more in detail about it. Okay, so that's the agenda for today, right? So if you are okay, so let's move ahead. Okay, we'll also use what are the different just one second. Oh man, yeah, we'll also talk about what are different instruments, what are the techniques and instruments used in the assessment center. We'll share some laundry list of different tools used, and this list can be is very, very long. We can go on, but we'll talk about one of the most important tools which are used and instruments used in the assessment center towards the end of the session. Okay, so let's start with a question, and I will request if in the chat you could write down. I know people are on mute, so it's a large group, so we cannot talk to everyone. So we'll use the chat box. So the first question is, what do you think is an assessment center? And how do you think it is related to competency mapping? So let me just wait for a minute, few seconds, and let me invite some comments from all of you. Use the chat box, and my colleagues are, we are mapping, we are watching what exactly are your comments coming up. So Sushil, have you started getting some comments? Okay. So what is an assessment center, and how do you think it is related to competency mapping as we understand right now? So guys, is my sound audible? Can you just put in the chat box, are you able to hear me? Okay, so I'll keep mic close to my mouth so it is audible. Thank you for the feedback. Yes, so we are getting some answers. Shelby management from Deepti. Yes, is the way to assess individuals on the competencies mapped to their roles. Perfect. Perfect. Happy to know. I think you guys have fairly good understanding of what assessment center is. So that's a good thing to know. Okay, so and I think this chat is available to everyone. So I think it's a peer learning, adult learning. It's not only me, but we'll learn from each other in the process. And let's make it as interactive as possible. So thank you for your feedback. So let's move on. Okay, so I think as some of you have already mentioned, what is an assessment center? I think there are 4 basic things, components, what will constitute something to be an assessment center. One it's a structured approach. It's not an ad hoc get together to evaluate some people. No, it's a very, very well planned. And as I talk further, you will know how meticulously this assessment center is planned. So there's a lot of preparations required to actually set it up and to conduct it. So it's a very structured approach. And it uses a group of tools and techniques, as some of you have also mentioned. For example, compared to a behavioral based interview, which is one instrument we use to assess a candidate, here we use multiple tools, right? Tools and techniques to assess an individual or a group. Typically, assessment center is meant for assessing a group of people by a group of assessors. So it's a structured approach involving a group battery of exercises, and I'll tell you why we are using a battery of tools and techniques, not depending only on one. And typically it is used for a group, right? And this group could be a set of candidates, it could be group of potential candidates for promotion, etc., right? Second thing, multiple techniques uh, could include actually the job related simulations, it could include interviews, it could include psychometric tests, multiple, it could be in basket exercise, and we'll talk some of the tools which are typically used in a assessment center. So one, it's a structured approach using a group of tools to set a group of or individual or a group, right? And typically it is for a group using multiple techniques. Then it also provides, what does it do? It provides us, the organization or the assessors, it provides information, insight about the candidate, about their fit to a particular role. It's about the skills they possess. And also, I think most important use of assessment center is it also gives us a lot of insight into what are the potential of this candidate for taking up future roles or different roles in the organizations, right? So it's a absolutely use. That is why assessment centers is a very prevalent tool or platform or a technique used for developmental purposes, for assessing future leaders, while we also use it for assessing candidates for a current job. But I think invariably a lot of use of assessment center is for assessing the potential of the employees, a set of employees in the organization. Then I think what we are saying, it's a multiple, right? It's not a one-to-one situation. It is multiple, many-to-many relationship. That means multiple tools used for multiple participants by multiple assessors. So you can imagine the efforts involved in setting up and conducting an assessment center is pretty intense. That is why one has to be very judicious in really selecting for which exercise, for which set of people you can use this. I mean, for example, in a BPO, right, where they hire thousands of people, I mean, the efforts involved by the assessor and the organization and the assessees is so high that you can't use this for a bulk hiring, for example, that kind of situation, because you just cannot do it. So you have to be selective in terms of where exactly it can be used, right? And we'll talk a little more about it. So net, what's an assessment center? It's a structured approach, multiple techniques used by multiple for participants, by multiple assessors, right? Which gives us the current fit and also the potential. Okay, so coming to the point that I was talking, sometimes we are confused, right? Is assessment center same as development center? And I can tell you in my experience, and Sushil will agree with me, that it is used interchangeably quite a lot, right? So let's see what is the difference between an assessment center and a development center. Okay, so first of all, what? So a series of assessments. So what is assessment center? Is a series of assessments to evaluate employees. And development center is no different. I mean, that also does the same thing. So as far as what is concerned, both are same. If we move to why part assessment center is more for taking a decision on someone's fit to the role, right? So normally it is used for recruitment. And as I mentioned, on selective positions, it cannot be used for bulk recruitment. For promotion, for particular critical role or senior roles in the organization, it is used for that. Or the performance appraisal also sometimes, because certain organizations really invest a lot in when appraising the employee. The traditional way could be, it is, filling up an appraisal form and there's a performance discussion that a manager has with the employee. But a lot of times organizations spend really good amount of time in giving a chance to an employee to perform over not only a discussion but during assessment center, which is much more, it takes away the bias and which is much more fair. So that is what assessment center is, why part. But development center, it is purely for developmental purpose. Now, as an example, I would say, for example, you have identified a set of high potential employees, right, in the organization. Now, you need to invest on their development against certain roles. So this exercise possibly can help. It's a non-threatening environment. It is finding out which are the areas, if we really invest on in time, it will help these high potential employees to perform better when in reality they get access to those roles, when those roles are made available to them. So it's a purely developmental purpose, and that's a very good use of, that's the development center, which is slightly different than assessment center. End result, in assessment center, it is a decision on recruitment, whether person is getting promoted, yes or no, or performance appraisal, what the performance rating would be to an employee. It's a very definitive decision typically, right, taken under one of these areas. Whereas development center, what happens at the end is we give a detailed feedback to an individual about the development plan. Invariably, it is also a practice that this plan is shared with the ecosystem. That means maybe their HR partner, their manager, so that it is not only on the employee that this development plan is made, but the stakeholders are also involved in this, right? So there's a subtle difference in the intent, but sometimes the exercise are the similar, but their intent or the decision that you take out of that is slightly different, right? So we thought we'll just help you clarify the difference between what an assessment center is and what a development center is, right? Okay, so once knowing the difference between both, let's move ahead and let's give you a real scenario. And this example that we are putting up here on the screen is typically a one-day assessment center for recruitment, right? Typically for recruitment. And some of you would be familiar with the way it happens, right? So if you see, at 10 o'clock, suppose it starts, people arrive, and just notice that in different boxes at different time, see the activity is mapped and the timings are very precisely defined, because it has to work like a clock, right? The whole exercise. And by the way, by design, it is meant to be very packed, whether it is 1 day or 2 days. Sometimes assessment centers can run for 3 days as well. One thing, characteristics of an assessment center will be, it will not be very loose in terms of, for example, out of 8 hours, one is busy for 3-4 hours, then they are allowed to go and work on their e-bills. No, it is meant to be very packed and tight, right? And it should work like a clock. And that is why a lot of logistics support is required. It has to be managed extremely well. So in this case, this is a typical case example of a recruitment exercise happening at 10 o'clock. People come, they collect the badges. At 10:15, it's an introduction and orientation to the candidates by the employer or the HR, whosoever the case may be. Then there's a particular test, reasoning test is given. Then there's a personality test. Then there's a time for lunch, meeting with the current employees. There's a technical interview. Again, there's a break given, individual task, right, etc., etc. And 5:30 they depart. So it's just an example for you to feel that it's an assessment center used for recruitment. And as we mentioned here, it is many. There are many instruments used here, as we mentioned earlier. It's done for a group, so it's not one employee, but a group of employees, and there are multiple assessors, right? So that's a typical characteristics of an assessment center. It's a multiple to many situation. Okay, so let's move on. Let's ask a question. Where do you think assessment centers can be applied in an organization? Some of it we have mentioned, but I would like to invite your suggestions or your comment on what do you think it can be used based on your experience, and put it in the chat box, and let's see, and what your impression is. So let's give a minute for people to respond. So Sushil, have you started getting some comments? Hiring promotion, yes. Global role transitioning, yes. Restructuring, succession planning, perfect. Yes, Abhay saying top talent identification and service selection board. I think defense uses it very, very extensively in a very, very meticulous way. Critical roles, JD evaluation. Great. Yes, I think absolutely perfect. So, I think the comments that you guys have made are true. So let's see where we can use assessment center. So let's move ahead. Thank you for your comment, by the way. So in our with our experience and our knowledge, there are typically 5 areas, applications of assessment center. There could be more as we talk about, but typically there are 5 situations, 5 opportunities area where assessment center can be used. One is for recruitment, and we just saw a case as an example. Then promotion and placements, and the way placement means it may not be a promotion, but it could be a lateral move to a different role within the organization, right? So sometimes it is used for that. As I mentioned, it is used for appraisal sometimes, and few organizations use, but few organizations where the number of employees is less, they can really afford to invest so much of time. Then possibly some of the organizations use that. And training and development is a very, very frequent use of assessment center and the competency mapping. So these are 5 areas, 5 applications of assessment center, typically based on our understanding and knowledge. There could be more, and as we go along, so that we could talk about it, right? And today, in particular, we will talk more about competency mapping as one of the application of assessment center compared to the rest. There could be many. It's a vast subject, but since we have a limited time, and we would talk more about how we can use assessment center for competency mapping, right? Okay. So another question. So what are, and use chat box to put your comments on, and thank you. You are very, very engaging team. So thank you very much for your comments. Don't shy away. Your comment could be right or wrong, but please share, what you think are some of the applications of assessment center, right? We have mentioned 5 that, that is our impression, but I would like to hear from you in case you use assessment centers or you have heard about it other than these 5. Go ahead. So I have a comment that you are not able to hear me. Yes, succession planning, management training course selections, MDPs. Any more comment? Yes, because once you have the training requirements, once you know the development need in this, especially in the development centers or assessment centers for development, you could possibly lead to what training programs can be done. Okay, Okay. So I think you're right in most of the comments that you have made. Absolutely, and there could be many, many more ways of using assessment centers, application of assessment centers. So let's move further. Okay, you know, I have used assessment centers for many, many years, right? And I'm particularly a big fan of using these, but on, wherever it is critical, right? And I personally feel there are certain advantages of doing assessment centers compared to the traditional or a multiple tool used for assessing employees or a candidate. One, it's a fair opportunity to the candidate whosoever appears in the assessment center. Why it is fair? One, because it's not dependent just on one interview. Sometimes you hear people saying, oh, it was my bad day, I had just one interview, 15 minutes, I just could not crack it, right? So one, it gives a fair opportunity over elongated period to a candidate, number one. Second is, it is not one person's judgment. Sometimes multiple people are assessing, so it takes away the bias of one individual assessor for the candidate or the or the employee, whatever the case is, right? Second, it's an improved accuracy because the use multiple channels of testing, so the chances of error really go down. And it not only bases the skill level or the competence in the current role, but it also predicts a kind of performance based on the potential assessment. And especially in case of a recruitment, it's an opportunity for employers, hiring manager or HR or the MD of the company. I mean, for them to really have, candidate has an exposure to the organization for a day or two, depending on the period. And during this period, a candidate gets a feel of the organization, right? What this brand is all about, what are they talking about, what do they stand for. So it's an opportunity for a candidate. Then it takes away personal bias, as I mentioned, and the candidates also get an insight into company's culture. Employees also sometimes get to know a little more about the company, but the candidates definitely gain from this. So these are some of the advantages of the assessment center. So let me ask you, let me go back. Can you also put any other additional advantages that you feel can be of the assessment center? Can you put in the chat box what are any other additional advantages of assessment center? So I would invite your comments. Hello effect, yes. Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of comments here. Hello effect, absolutely. Real-time picture, multi-stakeholders buy-in. Yes, that's an important point. Multiple ways of assessing. Absolutely correct. Efficiency of the training program. So I think these are good points, but I think primarily these are the 6 advantages of running assessment center. So let me possibly go a little faster. So now let's change gear. So far we were talking about what an assessment center is, what are the advantages, what is the difference between development center and assessment center, etc., etc. What are the applications? So we'll pick up today's discussion. We are halfway through our discussion, but let's spend second half of the session today more on how can we use assessment center for competency mapping, right? So there are 4 basic steps here. One, you have to identify, you means as an organization should know what are the competencies to be assessed, right? And by the way, in most of the matured organizations, they would have a well-structured competency framework, which would define what are the different roles and what are the competencies, sub-competencies required at what level, which are important, which are not important, I mean, which are highly important, which are less important, behavioral and skills. So there's a complete competency framework is there for most of the matured organizations. But many times we will find in a growing organizations into new industries, I mean, like technology, there are a lot of new industries are coming up now where this competency framework is not clearly articulated. So first of all, that exercise has to be done. Then one has to decide what kind of exercises one has to go for. Then what kind of tools are required to be deployed in that assessment center. And then organization gets a fair share of, I mean, by doing this exercise, organization also gets to know a lot of information about the competencies, which otherwise they might not have known. But through this exercise, their own clarity, happens on, in this area. Okay, so the development and implementation of assessment centers, I think it's a very technical task. It's not easy. It requires a lot of understanding, deep understanding of the whole framework, how it is set up, how it is designed, and so it's a quite a technical job, I would say, right? Now there are three particular things about development and implementation of assessment centers. One, the competency-based assessment center model. This integrates, few things. One, the competency development, because as I mentioned, you must have a competency framework, in the organization. Then you have to have an assessment center and typically a multi-source assessment strategy. I think it's a combination of these three. So as I mentioned first, it's a very systematic approach of linking the competency development assessment center and multi-source assessments. So it's a combination of these three, right? That is what is the crux of the development and implementation of assessment centers. Let's examine this a little more in detail. So from our research, from Strandscape research and from the research which is available in public domain, they're typically, in a very typical way, there are 7 steps of which are for integrated competency-based assessment center model, right? Now, in particular situation, based on organization's need or a particular situation, organizations may go for, maybe skip a couple of steps here or maybe add some additional steps. But in a very traditional manner, these are 7 steps that one has to go through, for designing a assessment center for competency mapping, right? Now, and we'll deal with them in the next few minutes, one by one. So let's go through one, all of them. First of all, it's a building the hierarchical competency system, and I'll talk a little more about it as we go along, that different roles, different level, what competencies are required, sub-competencies, then sub-competency assessment center, activity metrics, then the center activities, what are the objectives, what will you observe, behavior, where will say person is ready or not ready, what are those performance objectives in that session. Then what kind of material should be used, tools should be showed, how to design, and then assessors, which is most important. How will you pick up assessors from outside or inside the organization? How will you train them? And then how do you communicate with the stakeholders? So these are very commonsensical, logical steps that one has to use as recommendation. But as I mentioned, sometimes organization may decide that they want to, maybe add certain steps to the whole exercise, or they want to, skip a couple of steps. But I think in our experience, these are very standard model, recommended model that one should go with. So let's examine each of these steps, in next few minutes. Then we'll also talk about what could be multiple tools and techniques used in assessment center for our understanding. So if you allow, let's move ahead. Okay, so first, let's talk about first step 1 and 2. Step 1 is building hierarchical competency system, because that's a basic of and the starting point of doing a assessment center for competency mapping. Because unless you have a competency framework in the organization which is really accepted and communicated and implemented for various people systems, for example, it should be integrated with your recruitment system. How would you evaluate the roles? So it should be mapped to that competency framework. How do you assess people? How do you promote people? How do you train people? So it's a DNA, it's a core of all the people processes. So that model has to be there. Then it has also to be broken. Sometimes organizations stay with a very high level competency, like cluster of competencies at that level. It has to be broken down into sub competencies and also identify what are the behavioral indicators Because I'll give an example. Sometimes you may say, hey, person should be a good listener, rate 1 to 4, 1 to 5, right? But sometimes my understanding of what two is and what Sushil's understanding of what two is could be different, right? So unless it is supported with behavioral indicators and descriptors, what would a two mean for a good listener? What would a three mean to a good listener? There are chances of misunderstanding, and we all assessing the same thing in a very different way, and that's a tough thing to achieve. It's not easy thing to achieve, right? Now, second is you could be very generic or could be specific. Sometimes when you are in a, say, factory mode, a particular skill you need to assess that is very, very specific to a task, right? So it's not something very generic, but it is very, very specific. So I think these steps have to be identified. Uh, then either the collective or the abstract terms or subcompetencies, as I mentioned, they are very, very, they're specific of the task and activities or the competencies, behavioral competencies required for the particular roles. They are very measurable, right, in day-to-day activities, so subcompetencies. So I think that's a recommended approach, that rather than staying at a top level, going to a sub-competencies level and measuring them in a competency mapping exercise in the assessment center is a recommended. So first thing is you should have a framework in place, right? Then the second one is to activity metrics. What particular activities would be required to measure that? What is the right? And secondly, as we mentioned, and our research says, that's the whole purpose of assessment center. There must be multiple raters, right? And that takes away bias of a singular rater for a particular exercise for a set of people or an individual. It's a multi-rater. And I'll tell you, in my experience, and sometimes, we, even the manager, for example, if I'm a manager of an employee, right? I have a certain perception of an employee, but when I sit in a panel discussion or with other assessors, I got a lot of insights about my own team through other people, because my thinking about an individual is fixed bias. I may come with my own bias, but having an advantage, it's an investment of multiple raters, is that you get very diverse views, you get very different point of view sometimes. So it's an advantage to a candidate, to a assessee, that they have an advantage of multiple raters, which reduces the bias. Although it's an investment, but our level of accuracy can be very, very high, right? And then it avoids the common error. So this is basic step 1 and 2, that first you have to define the competency framework, and second one is you have to define the activity at a maybe sub competency level, and using the multi-rater feedback. So that's a step 2, right? And I think a lot of you may not feel very confident that with this, can I go ahead and set up the assessment center? May not be, right? But it will give you some framework and an idea, but it may not give you full knowledge for you to go ahead and set up the competency center, or sorry, assessment center, if you have not done it earlier. But it's just an orientation session today, right? Okay, so let's move on with step 3. So what are the activities? So the one of the our research says there are 2 ways. The way you typically go ahead about it, you say, okay, now I need to assess a person, a candidate or SSE on, say, creativity, right? Now, if that is a competency you are measuring, now you will go with a laundry list of how can you identify. Can you give a role exercise? Can you give a simulation or a situation? How would you assess the creativity? So when you make a laundry list of such activities, so when you're designing, your stakeholders or those who are involved in creating the assessment center or designing the assessment center, you will say, yes, activity A, B, C, is it useful or not, right? There are 2 ways of doing. One, you will say yes and no. Yes, this is useful, this is not useful, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then you pick up the one which are yes by multiple people and then adopt it. That is one way. But second way, which is a suggested method, is that rather using dichotomy of yes and no, what about giving a rating to an activity to measure a certain, say, competency, right? For example, for creativity, you may say activity A, right? Is it useful? Is it fit for assessing? You may say, yeah, maybe 2 on a scale of 5, right? Or, can we give a situation and give 15 minutes for person to come with an answers, particular ways how they would approach, how creative they are in approaching solving a problem. They may say, yes, it is 5, right? So it helps us to know what activity should be used, but it also tells us what is the relevance, to what degree this exercise is a fit for assessing that particular competency. So our recommendation simple here is, when you identify certain activities, right, and you, I'm sure, would choose from a basket of multiple options that you have, while choosing, suggested method is use a 5-point Likert scale about those activities, which will give you not only which activities should be used, but it will also give you an idea of how relevant it is, right? So that is one step, which is step 3. Now, when we go to step 4, which is very logical extension, then you compose a list of the appropriate subcompetencies and the performance objective. Performance objective could be, for example, if you have given an exercise, particular exercise which has to be done in, say, 15 minutes, right? You would expect certain outcome. So you would define that for this particular role in this exercise, what is an expected outcome of the performance objective of the person, from the candidate, right? Or they should have, for example, solved out of after 5 situations, at least 3 situations they should have solved, something like that. So what is the performance center? And we'll talk about it as we go along. We also need to do a pilot. Never just design in a room assessment center and put it in use and just launch it. Never. You always need to, because what you think initially, in reality, the reality could be very different. So always it is recommended that you must go for a pilot once you have an initial design, right? Then this is most important, the second bullet point. One, there are certain exercises which will give you a number, right? 3 out of 4, 7 out of 10, etc. But I think the assessors who have the context of the role, context of the organization, they know the people, assessors, the which background they come from, they have to interpret that quantitative data into meaningful insights, right? So purely quantitative data is not helpful. One has to interpret it in a meaningful way using the context of the organization and the role and the situation for which the person is being assessed, right? So I think another point is, designers should examine the competencies to determine the fit. So we have already spoken about. So I think the key point here is, don't depend only on the quantitative data, but it should be interpreted by assessors who have the context of the situation, right? And you have to identify a list of the objectives or the exercises and what the performance objective is. So these are done in step 4. So as we move along, step 5 and 6, so there are 7 steps. So we are on 5th now. I think this is important. A lot of us sometimes we have a hurry. So this exercise, development of assessment center, should be given time. It should never be done in a hurry. For example, your MD and CEO comes that, hey, I want assessment center next Monday, right? Just go and do it. So what we do is, we suddenly call few friends or HR consultant or Stenscape. Can you do it for us? What is available off the shelf? Oh, these are 2 discs is available. This is available. Okay, pick up and just run it, right? No. I think off the shelf, while it is quick, but always our recommendation is that you must have a custom made solutions or the tools, right? It is always useful. Why? Because it is taking care of the context with which you are running the assessment center. Context of the organization, context of the role, context of the purpose for which assessment center is run. So customization is very important, and invariably that is why you can take help from some of the consultants or experts within the organization or outside while running the designing the centers. So off the shelf is quick sometimes. Sometimes you don't have time, then it is recommended to go for off the shelf material. But if you have time, which is a recommendation, you should see the context, what is relevant, what is not relevant. And then, next step, which is logical step 6, is that we sometimes selecting the assessors. And my personal bias is towards training the internal assessors, right, and on the exercise, on the assessment center, rather than purely depending on outside or the psychologist as an assessor. Because sometimes what happens, they may come, but they may miss the context of the organization or the background or the environment or the culture of the organization. They may miss that. So I think a combination could be a good option, where you use certain assessors within the organization, but they should be duly trained. I know in IBM, for example, where I mean, I've spent a lot of my time, where I was the assessor for, country general manager, that is head of the business in India, which is such a large business for India. So I was in a part of assessment center for those roles. Uh, Believe me, people came from CHQ. They trained us for 3 days, and they really certified that I am certified to run the assessment center, because it's a responsibility, right? We cannot put anyone into the assessment center and we can't play with the life and the career of the SSCs, right? So selection of the assessors is very important, and their training is very, very important. So our recommendation is that, don't depend purely on the outside assessors, but have a mix of assessors which are inside, which are trained, certified if required, and they have been properly updated. So that's very important, because inside assessors would have a lot of context. Or if you're selecting assessors from outside, please spend enough time in giving them a context of the role of the SSCs, of the organization, why are you doing, etc., etc. So that's very, very important. Okay, so let's move on. It may appear to be very simple, communication with the stakeholders, and this is where I can tell you one of the most common derailment factors, right? Because we don't communicate enough with the stakeholders, including the SSCs. Sometimes if we don't tell SSC that, why the hell are you here, right? Sometimes they have a lot of anxiety within them. They are apprehensive, why the hell I am selected for this, while it may be for their own good, for developmental need. But unless communicated clearly, they may be confused or anxious, which will not give the best outcome of the whole exercise, right? So educating stakeholders, which could be managers of the SSC, or the recruitment candidate, or the employees, high potential employees that you're talking about, then giving information just in time at the right opportunity, right, over a period, so that people are able to absorb it. Comparative information. Sometimes, giving comparative information would mean that, hey, like in IBM, this is how we are doing. But by the way, this center is a most prevalent practice. This assessment center technique is used by Microsoft, by HP, by our competition, or the great organizations. So it's an established industry practice. So by providing this information from us as HR leaders, what we do is we tell them, hey, it's not something, it takes away some anxiety, some suspicion from their mind, why it is happening. Is there a hidden agenda, or is it only we are doing, or it's an industry practice? So providing that comparative information is helpful. Articulate the purpose. It is developmental, or it is selection. Of course, it is selection, promotion, or recruitment. So I think very clearly articulate. Don't hesitate, don't shy away from saying that yes, your selection or promotion depends on your performance in this assessment center. Don't shy away from saying that, right? Then a pilot, as I mentioned earlier, never design a system in the room and just implement it. Always run a pilot with a set of people. I can tell you, in my personal experience, I have had the maximum learning. Some very stupid things, some steps that we had missed. Unless we did a pilot, sometimes we would have gone ahead and made a mess of the whole thing. So run a pilot is most important. And communicating responsibilities. And as I mentioned, the whole exercise has to work like a clock. And I have run assessment centers which run over 3 days, right? And very clearly, your job is to make sure that the material that is coming out of the assessments, it is properly printed and a binder made, as simple as that. Okay, you'll make sure that this cohort, sometimes you don't have a group which moves from exercise A to B, right? In my experience, a lot of time when we have, say, 20 people in a group, we make batches of 4, right? 4 batches of 5 people each, right? So while one person is going through one exercise, other person does something else. So unless we really coordinate like a clock, who is doing what, the whole thing can fall apart, right? So it may sound very tactical, but I can tell you, a lot of success of assessment centers depend on very clearly articulating who is doing what at what time, and doing it multiple times so that extremely clear about what everyone is doing. So I think the step 7, it is maybe sounding like a very operational and tactical, but let me tell you from my experience, we may strategize anything big, but if not done well, the whole exercise can fall apart. So it has to be taken care extremely well, right? So I think we have gone through 7 steps as we had mentioned. So it's just an orientation to you. It may not give you deep dive or skill to you to run the assessment center, design it, but at least it'll give you an idea. Okay, let's go to, let's say, time for question. It's quite some time that we have asked you a question. Let's use our chat box and let's hear from you. What were the different activities you have come across in an assessment center? Now, we'll tell you from our knowledge what we think they are, but I would like to hear from you. Where are you today? If you have run assessment centers, what do you think we do there? And if you have heard from someone or read about it, please share your comment, right? And don't hesitate, even if your answer is wrong, doesn't matter, because we are all learning here. So go ahead. Intra exercise, yes. Role-based simulation. Perfect. Essays, behavioral interviews, BI, interview, role plays. Wow. So we are dealing with very educated or informed group. Okay. No, I think you're right. So let's go through some, exercises. I think instrument that used, we have already spoken about it. I'll quickly jump to some of the activities that are used in assessment center. Will not go through all of them, but I'll maybe pick up some of them. So in basket technique is a very, very common I'm sorry, tool used, where you give a a kind of, as the name suggests, you have a certain set of activities which are assigned to you in a basket. I mean, not in a literal sense, but it may come through your inbox, or you'll be given some piece of instructions. You have a number of things to be done. You have certain psychometric tests, and that is where Standscape also comes. We can support you with that. There are a lot of psychological tests, group discussions, qualification screening. Sometimes what it means is there are certain knowledge or skill that you need, which is a must kind of qualifying criteria. For example, suppose you are an accountant. If you don't know how to operate on an Excel, I mean, you can't really run the show, right? So sometimes these are qualifier round, qualification screening that is done. Case studies is a very standard method where you give a situation to a person and ask the person to respond into, and you must be familiar with a lot of these. Physical ability, you may be surprised in certain roles which are specifically a shop floor, where you need a certain physical ability for a person to perform the role. So sometimes you may include some of those also in the exercises, right? Then sometimes you also do a background as an exercise integrity test. So there's some psychological test to indicate whether you're likely to falsify or fudge some information. There are some tests available. Structured interview is a very standard way. Management problems, give a situation, or fictional documents you can give, right? You can give a situation to a person that, oh, you are in office today, you are a CEO, suddenly there is a press release, some issue in the press, you have to go for a press conference, what would you, kind of thing, right? So sometimes you get some documents, what the press has said, what your MD is saying, what board is saying. So you can be given some letters, memos, and you have to act in the situation. Literally what you do is, through these exercises, is that you kind of experience a typical day in that role, right? That is what you do. And I'll tell you, I used to run assessment center for first line managers, right? Beginners, 2 days. And a lot of time, some candidates came and said, Sanjeev, I don't think I am ready for that role, or I like this role, right? So sometimes through this exercise, you also help SSE to really decide whether they are really up for that role or not. Sometimes that's also could be an outcome of this, right? So let me ask you quickly, some few 30 seconds. We have listed some activities typically that we, from experience, we feel can be used in assessment center. Let me hear from you. What could be some other activities that you think can be deployed in an assessment center? So let me take 1 minute and quickly let's get your responses. Okay, case studies, role plays, simulation, yes. Case study we mentioned, yes. Role plays and simulation, yes. Any other thing? Yes. So we have few responses from Anasuya Banerjee. I think you're right. So let's move on. I think this is pretty comprehensive list. The only comment I want to make that this is not exhaustive. This is just illustrative list, and this list can go multiple times of what it is mentioned here, right? But it is more of an indicative list for you to get an appreciation. Okay, so let's we are coming close to this session, and just want to hear any question. Although in this construct, since it's a large forum, we may not be able to answer all the questions, but we'll see if we can pick up maybe a couple of questions before we close the session. So please put your question. Please put your question in the chat box, and what we'll do today, if we can answer now, we'll try. Otherwise, I think we'll try to see if we can answer them later on to you. One question is what does the talent measure involve? So let me request Sushil. Maybe I'll call out. So what this means is a very natural personal characteristics that are associated with success in certain jobs, right? Some of the things assessed through talent measures are like problem solving ability, work ethics, leadership characteristics, or interpersonal style, right? On a broader level, what I would say, talent measures, what it tends to predict two kind of performances. Number one, what a person can do, for example, ability to learn new tasks quickly, stay calm in a stressful situation. And a lot of time in assessment centers, you create an artificial stress, right? What a person will do, for the example, attendance, work ethics, etc. So that's what typically would a talent measure be. I hope I could clarify that to you. Okay, so what we'll do is, since time is limited, at the end I would, we have a closing remarks to be made, and we are very conscious of the time that we don't want to take it beyond. What we'll do, we'll try to answer those questions later on. And Sneha, you want to take over? Okay, so there is a competency mapping certification session which is coming up to Standscape, which is one of our flagship program. The batch is starting very soon in the month of July, so stay tuned for that. And this is our website, that is www.strandscape.com, or you could also send an email for any query related to this topic or in general to contact@strandscape.com, right? So we look forward to your comments, your queries, and we look forward to some of you who are interested in this particular skill. It's a huge skill, right? So I think people who want to develop that skill through a proper certification program, you are most invited to encourage to join that. Whenever we announce that, it's most likely to come in July, and we'll let you know the location and the particular date, right? So stay tuned on Standscape through our website, and you can write to us on this email address. So we are dot on time. So with that, me and Sushil join in thanking you for your patience and very active participation throughout the session. I hope it was helpful to you. in terms of understanding the assessment center difference with how is it different from development center, different techniques used, steps to create an assessment center, design and run it, right? So I hope it was helpful to you. I enjoyed talking to you guys, and I must say this is a very, very well informed group. Most of the comments that you made, so you're already at a great awareness level. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of the day. So we'll close this session now. Bye bye.
So thanks everyone, and we have posted some of the links where you can see our past webinars and also the email ID to which you can write your queries to us. You can connect with us on that. Thank you very much, everyone.